Okay. Been a while. What have I got all of this thing? You're on. We're on. Hello. Would you like to take your seats, please? Oh, I sound very echoey. That's terrible. Oh, God. Right. Thank you so much for joining us this evening after another long and full day of conferencing. You might have to bear with me because I can hear myself echoing back at you, and it's really disconcerting just how extraordinarily northern and parochial I sound. Here you are. I'm really looking forward tonight to having a conversation with you all and with Judy. And what I thought we would do is that I've got a few questions for Judy and we can have a bit of a chat, but then I'm going to open the floor to questions from you, because I think that would be a really useful thing to do. And Judy, I'm not going to start with a lengthy oration about your many marvelous achievements. I assume that many of the people here know you already, but I'm hoping that the conversation we have will unfold your various contributions to the field as we go. So, look, all right.
Thank you very much. Gosh, it is weird, isn't it?
It is weird, yeah. But we've got comfy. I can't believe that
Sarah, I'm really delighted that you're looking forward to this. I have to say that my attempt to cancel this by setting off a fire in the University of Glasgow failed, but then I did try to lock the door downstairs and I thought that might work, but it's clearly failed. So sorry about that. Well, I'm sorry about that.
We got club chairs though,
Yep,
which is a win. I'm thrilled.
Yes, but not the port.
So Judy, could you start by telling us a bit about your first visit to the Soviet Union, which I believe is 1971?
Yes, it was. It was 1971, and it was under the auspices of a cultural exchange agreement between the Soviet Union and the UK. And it had already been running probably a decade by then. And there were just 22 British students, and I suspect actually one or two of them are here, who went over to the Soviet Union. And I was 21 at the time. I was in either the first or second year of my PhD. And, you know, we were put on the Baltica boat and arrived in Leningrad. And I remember I had this sensation of, as the boat, which had gone from Harwich and stopped off in Helsinki, and then it went down the canal to Leningrad, and I just had this sensation of a zip closing behind me, because it was quite extraordinary. I think it's quite difficult to convey to younger people today precisely how little we knew about, if you like, everyday life in the Soviet Union. So it was a genuine black box.
So if I can just interrupt there and ask you, so as you kind of, the zip closed behind you and you come in to Leningrad, so how much did you know about the Soviet Union by then? Sort of where had you been so far? What was your knowledge? How was your language? What was going on?
Well, I'd travelled quite a lot in Europe. I'd done the interrailing at the end of my degree, and you know, I'd holidayed in Italy, Spain, which was actually quite unusual. We're talking about, that was the 1960s, and I was, you know, I went up to university in 1968, so I'm that 1968 generation, and I didn't really know anything at all. I had done a subsidiary subject in Russian history at Leeds. I was at Leeds University, and it was John Morrison and David Collins, and I was just totally absorbed and entranced by what I read. And unfortunately, but what I found most interesting was Stalinism. And David Collins had given us a wonderful reading list, and it was actually Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon that really caught my imagination. Of course, we now subsequently have found out that he was a bit of a bastard to women. But I was just sort of totally captured by it, because I was actually doing a degree in geography at Leeds University, but I was much more interested in that. So what I knew about the Soviet Union was from literature and from the history course I'd done. And I had done 1 year of Russian language, took A-level Russian, got an A. But that was about it, because apart from that, we did not know anything about the Soviet Union apart from what was in the newspapers, and that was mostly negative. So I went there absolutely with no knowledge at all. And I have to say that you're going to have to stop me, aren't you? I'm going to go wittering on. But at that time, in the late 1960s and sort of early 70s, what people were doing when they were traveling was either going to America and renting a wreck on the East Coast and driving across to the West Coast. So that's what a lot of my contemporaries did. Or they were heading off to India to experiment with interesting substances. But I just was fascinated by this sort of black hole of the Soviet Union, and I wanted to do something that other people weren't doing. Okay. And other than the other 21 students with me, other people weren't doing it. So I didn't know anything about it, about the country. I was incredibly ignorant.
Was it an even gender mix, your 21 students, or was it mostly blokes?
It was actually, when I was thinking that you might ask me that, and I was sort of trying to remember. It was strangely equal, actually. Okay. It was probably about half and half. It might have, I can't believe the British Council was really interested in getting
like Hunger Games.
No, it might have actually been, because that quite a large proportion of the group were from literature and language departments. So I think that was probably why there was more or less a gender balance. Or maybe I just didn't notice how many interesting men there were on the trip. I don't know. We go through the list and try to work out.
So could you comment on what the research agenda was like in the 70s and how it changed, and what you think the shock points were for you? So I'm thinking now a little bit more on that longer trajectory, sort of 80s, 90s, noughties. Like, where do you see sort of breaks in the sort of research agendas and the methodologies?
Yes, certainly. It's completely different from now. And those of us who got into Soviet and East European area studies, we were either sort of interested in Marxism or we weren't. And so that was what the division is. But I think on both sides, whether you were interested in Marxism and having a discussion with Soviet colleagues about the appropriateness, helpfulness of different versions of Marxism to understand what was going on in the country, or, as I said, the opposite. But we were all sort of imbued with the idea that to be academics, to be good scientists, we were dealing with objectivity. So and with natural science techniques. So this was all the era of the quantification in the social sciences. And so I think those of us who were from the social sciences, we were all we would have been very surprised by the sort of work now that is being done on subjectivities and the cultural turn hadn't happened when we first went there. And then the literature people, I don't think those of us in the social studies really had any idea what on earth they were doing and why they were doing it. There wasn't a very productive dialogue between the two.
Okay. So would you say that's one of the kind of transformative areas, then there's more sort of interdisciplinary kind of move.
Yes, I think that because thinking about, you see, BASEES as a single area studies association didn't happen until just before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there were two separate professional associations, BUAS and NASIS, and there wasn't a lot of dialogue between them. So although we knew a lot of us were in interdisciplinary area studies, that had only just started with the HATER committee money. And so we were involved in actually thinking about interdisciplinarity and where we were taking it, and what area studies was. So I was in at the beginning of that dialogue,
right?
Which
so you're like a foundation stone of area studies.
Foundation stone
like
of area studies, yes. But then the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union came at the time of the cultural turn in social studies. So we stopped being interested in the objective world and facts, and life became far more difficult, I think. And I remember sort of feeling I was drowning in this relativist soup. Right. In the 1990s.
So yes. Did you found it like personally, like difficult as a scholar to sort of navigate?
Well, I think I mean the point is, I think those, as I was saying, those of us who are in the social sciences, in area studies, I was pretty good at Marxism. That didn't mean I was a Marxist. I got terribly interested in Eurocommunism when it hit. But I think in terms of our theoretical framing of discussions, because we were engaged in a discussion with Soviet sort of historians, well, there weren't any sociologists, social scientists, there were geographers, didn't actually have, yeah, okay. We were all discussing, Marxism, and that's about facts and an objective world and historical processes and a totalizing theory, and we knew what we wanted to happen in the future. And of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union just brought that to an end. So in terms of our theoretical framing of our research, that suddenly just went out of the window. But that corresponded to the change generally that had been taking place in the disciplines towards, cultural studies and greater interest in subjectivities and so on.
So,
sorry, I don't need to be rude about cultural studies. I'm sort of I'm very interested.
You're not sounding rude at all. You're sounding engaged and,
yes, okay.
and involved. So if we just asked you a little bit about the shape of the field, but I suppose what I was interested in asking you about was actually the sort of shift in your own topics and the shape of your research as you've gone on, because you will correct me because I will be wrong, but my kind of general understanding is you really initially your individual scholarship was really on peasant studies in the late imperial period, and then you moved towards peasant women, and then from around 2005 you pivoted towards the more collaborative research models and carceral studies, right? So you've really covered a lot of ground, and I wondered if you would sort of kind of explain or talk about how you go from one to another and how you make those jumps.
Well, going to the Soviet Union set the parameters of everybody's research. So during the Cold War, scholars had choices to make. It was a very simple choice. If you wanted to go to the Soviet Union, there were certain subjects you knew you couldn't pursue in your research. And they were topics that were going to be too controversial or too critical of the Soviet Union. So if you wanted to go to the Soviet Union, you had to make that choice and choose a subject that wasn't going to be mean that you're not going to get the next visa. I have to say that it's come round again. Or you could say you could decide that you wanted to do research that was highly critical of the Soviet Union. You could say it's, no, I'm not saying it's more honest, but anyway, but that meant you couldn't go there. you know, and that is the sort of choice that an academic had to make. So those of us in the social sciences, because the Soviet Union didn't like us doing social sciences, and there weren't any social problems in Russia to look at in any case, a lot of us would choose historical topics or choose topics that could get you as close to the revolution as possible. And that's why I chose to do my doctoral thesis on the Stolypin land reform. But that also coincided in the subject with an interest in peasant studies. And that was Theodor Shanin, Moshe Lewin, and all these Sheila Fitzpatrick, you know, the big names in not only in Soviet and East European peasant studies, but generally there was an interest in what was going on in what we now call the global south. Back in those days, we dared to call it the third world, where there was a lot of interest in what, you know, in Marxism, in developing countries. And a lot of that was led, you know, by the Soviet work, or the work of the Soviet historians on the peasantry and the role of peasants in revolution. It all sounds, you know, so, well, I suppose it was a long time ago now. So that the choice of my research was pragmatic. I wanted to go to the Soviet Union, and I chose a topic that when I arrived in Moscow, everybody told me was ne aktualny, you know, and that was, you know, it was an irrelevant topic. Great, you know, and so that's how I got to that. And so it was natural, I think, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that I was already in peasant studies. And so my initial research was that I could actually go and meet some. So I spent the 1990s, well, not all the 1990s, because I made the mistake of having a baby in 1991, supremely bad timing. So I missed all the fun.
I hope your daughter's not tuned in.
No, actually it was 1990, wasn't it? Oh, yeah. No, but it was supremely bad timing, and it meant that I missed all the fun of wasn't there when the Berlin Wall came down. Really annoying. And I haven't forgiven my poor daughter that. But so the 1990s, I thought, well, look, suddenly I can actually go and look at rural Russia, because in the Soviet Union, we were only allowed 30 kilometers from outside Moscow without getting a visa to go into the countryside. And so I did this wonderful work, or wonderfully fun work, with Tatiana Nefyedova at the Academy of Sciences for about 10 years. And we did all these transects from the north of Russia down to the south, and east and west. And I was looking at peasant survival strategies in marginal regions. And it was when I was on, I was doing some work in the northern Urals, and I forgive people, I mean, people I've told this story to before now, is I was up in the north of Perm Oblast, interviewing peasants on how they grew cucumbers and so on. And I discovered that most of the people I was interviewing were either former prisoners, the children and grandchildren of prisoners in the Gulag, or, what was interesting, existing prisoners. And I found that one of the rivers we were, because we went on these baidarki kayaks down the rivers interviewing, and I was interviewing people in various villages, that there were still correctional colonies up there in the north of the oblast, and I was really sort of surprised about that, to find that there were people up in the north of Russia still in correctional colonies. They were being allowed out to collect mushrooms and berries because there was a bit of a food crisis in the colonies, but also you know, cutting trees for the timber industry. And I just, at that point, I just thought, this is fascinating. Why is Russia, or why is, you know, how can we explain why Russia has chosen, you know, over centuries to solve its problems of criminality, social deviancy, political opposition, by expelling people to the peripheries. And that's what got me into prison studies.
Yeah, you've actually ruined my next question.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay, because you've taken me there on a lovely journey, but now my question is redundant. But the other bit, so that really helps understand how we go from peasant studies to prisons and punishment because of
Yeah.
this sort of direct kind of discovery, which is very
Yes,
exciting.
yeah.
But what about the pivot from individual to collaborative research? Because I mean, that's a very area studies thing, isn't it? And it's very much the shape of the field in the 90s and the noughties that we've gone towards these, you know, the way in which funding is allocated has moved from individual towards collaborative and teams.
Yes. Well, I mean, the answer to that is it's pragmatism. And that is because universities changed, neoliberalization of higher education. So that, I mean, I started off in university in, 1968. Not many people went to university in those days. It was a small percentage of the population. It was before the great expansion of the higher education sector and the conversion of polytechnics into universities. And you were very much expected in those days to plough your own furrow, which is what I did. And I moved from Leeds University. I taught there for 6 years, and then this job came up in Oxford that I moved to. And initially, I just continued doing my own work and getting grants from the British Council or the British Academy to go over to Russia. And I sort of continued. I think the first grant I got was a Leverhulme grant, but that wasn't until the 2000s. Right. But what changed it, what I ought to say is I really valued the idea of collaborative work. In fact, what happened was that the head of my department called me in and said, we've got these new ways that our output and impact, no, we didn't have impact in those days, it was just output, was going to be measured. Judith, you publish in this journal called Soviet Studies, Asia Studies. That's not on the geography department's list. I was in a geography department. We need you to publish in the transactions of the Institute of British Geographers. And they said, you've got to get grants. So actually, Sarah, to be quite honest, it was because of the changes in the higher education system from individual research, and that was in the social sciences and the humanities, to collaborative research. But of course, it's been wonderful.
So you didn't choose it because you thought it was a great idea, but then once you started doing it, it turned out to be really fun.
Yes.
Okay,
that's right.
That works. I'm going to just step back for like one moment because you mentioned the move down from Leeds down to Oxford, and from memory of chatting to you, I think you were the first female member of staff at your college at Christ Church. Is that right?
I was, yes. We wouldn't call them staff.
Of course,
staff were the people who came in and emptied my
emptied your bins, not the people who are sitting on the big
I
chairs.
became what was at Christ Church. I became what was known, or what is still known, as an official student, with capital O and a capital S.
Okay.
For reasons I'm not going to explain why that was. So I basically became, I was the first female fellow of the college.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm exposing my status as an outsider.
But this happened. It was the sort of thing that happened to me because you weren't in Oxford allowed to call students, and I'd come from Leeds University, and where a student was a student with a small s. And, I had to, I went at a time when in Christ Church, there weren't students, there were young gentlemen, as they were known, and official students, which was me. I was one of those. So you had to learn a whole new language to go there.
And how did your esteemed male colleagues regard you as their new peer in the official student category?
My appointment had taken quite a long time, between the interview, and it was something like 3 months that passed. When we had the 25th anniversary of women at Christ Church, which was something I organized, I actually went into the archives and I said, oh, look, can I see, sorry, I shouldn't laugh about this. Can I see the minute from the time when I was appointed? And the thing is about Oxford, you don't want to hear all of this about Oxford, but anyway, it was a joint appointment between my department, which was geography, and Christchurch, which was where I was going to be the fellow. And geography wanted me, but the committee that had interviewed me at Christchurch didn't want me. It preferred somebody. There was a young man who was actually just still a doctoral student at the time. They wanted to appoint, but the minute of my appointment that came from eventually was that the committee said that actually I wasn't the first choice. This other person was, but they thought I would do. So that was, you know, that was really
that must have felt really rewarding when you look back and found that.
25 years later, you know, and by then I'd
did you get the feeling? Did you get the feeling that you would do when you arrived?
No, actually, I suspect I was like you know, a lot of people when you go to a new job in a new institution, you're trying to keep your head above water. And going from Leeds University, which was an ordinary university with ordinary normal people in it, I mean, somewhere. And in fact, you know, the sort of person I knew, I was very sort of close with a group of what was known as the Left Lunch Club that was run by Ralph Miliband, you know, so I went from this really exciting university as it was in those times to Christchurch. And it was just a sort of extraordinary feeling that I was on the stage and that the curtains would come down at some stage and we'd all go back to normal life. I mean, it was very, very weird. And the main thing I was trying to do was just keep my head above water, because my predecessor had left a note to help me, which was just one side of paper, in which he referred to me all the way through in the male third person. My successor will want to make his mind up about the students. And I had to learn about the tutorial system. You know, it's a very different place.
Yeah.
So the fact I was a woman, I don't really think I noticed initially.
Okay. Did you come to notice it more, or was it did it ease off?
Oh, I think no. I think it made me a feminist, because previously in Leeds, I mean, back in those days, you know, if you were interested in women's issues, you were either a socialist feminist or what became a feminist. And I was of the socialist feminist sort. So I thought we had to actually solve the social problems in society first. And, you know, the position of women would improve. It would all fall into place. When I got to Christchurch, it made me really rethink that. So I think that sort of made me a bit of a feminist.
So, I mean, so in terms of
that sort of feminist.
So, I mean, in terms of being a trailblazer then, so you were a trailblazer for women going into Christchurch, but what about area studies, which you've already told me that you were there really at the inception of area studies as a thing, but was there a significant gender imbalance there?
The NASEES conferences I used to go to, which were always in Cambridge, the wonderful Fitzwilliam College, because BUAS, who were they were the literature people, they used to move around, whereas NASEES was always in Cambridge. There were hardly any women at those conferences. There was Mary Macaulay, Olga Crisp. I'm sure there are other people here. Where are you? There you are. Mary Buckley. Were there many other people, women? No, there weren't that many. It was mainly men, but they were, it was Alex Nove, Michael Kayser, some fantastic people. Because at the conference, we'd always have a catching up on what's been happening in the region panel. And it would be Alex Nove, Michael Kayser, and the only woman would be Olga Crisp, wouldn't it? Who was the woman who did whose foreign policy, international relations? Forgotten. Thank you, Margot Light. Thank you. Yeah. So there were very few people in the social science, but I guess some things were different in BUAS. But once we merged into BASEES, then we got all those people from literature, all the women's girly subjects, and they joined BASEES. So they began to dilute the men a bit then.
So you've been...
I don't mean that about literature, by the way. Before you put together a 500-person petition, it's like cancel me. Yeah.
So you've been collaborating with individuals and institutions in sort of Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space for most of your career.
Yes.
And I know you've built up professional and personal relationships. Can you reflect on the challenges and rewards of building and maintaining those relationships?
Yes, well, I'll go back again to say that, of course, during the Cold War, the possibilities of collaboration didn't really exist. So this is something that came with the 1990s. And I'm sure that the people remember the 1990s were a real wild frontier. The stories you hear about people turning up with suitcases full of money to hand over to collaborators in Russia. And then the failure of the Russians actually to do any work. They took the money and run. I mean, they're not totally apocryphal. It was a bit like that.
But when you first went in 71, and then I think you went repeatedly after that.
No, I went almost every year.
Did you build friendships and intimate relationships?
No,
I there and sustained those.
Yes, but I'm not sure that I made those connections with the academics.
Right.
I made a lot of connections and friendships with Russians, but there was this sort of strange divide, I think, and it was for me. I don't know if this is true for other people in the Cold War, between the personal life and my social circle, which were mostly people who were in this sort of dissident milieu.
Right.
And then what I was doing in the Lenin Library and MGU or the Academy of Sciences, where I was meeting people, and the dialogue, certainly in the Soviet era, was, we would sort of pass each other in terms of our dialogue. So the possibility of building really sort of proper productive collaborative relationships really didn't happen until the late 1990s, early 2000s. And then the first one was with Tanya Nefedova, and which is we traveled together all over Russia, having the most extraordinary experiences. And so from that moment on, yes, I was sort of building networks and collaborations that turned out to be very productive. I think I was enormously fortunate in the people with whom I made connections. Yeah.
And so sort of reflecting on those experiences as you worked, right through that Cold War and then through the transitionary periods. So if you reflect on that, how do you think you can kind of cope with or sort of deal with the moral and ethical questions that are raised by field work in the Russian Fed today?
Well, today we're, of course, we have to deal with these within the framework of ethics committees, and so that's different from in the 1990s. Which, may I go back to the 1990s, because I think that because I think, and I don't want to be too critical of us, but when the end of the Soviet Union happened, I think those of us who had been sort of working in a very constrained intellectual environment in the 1970s and 80s, suddenly we could get to this to what was now Russia and the different parts of the region and start doing what we'd always really wanted to, sort of interviewing people and choosing subjects that had been completely out of bounds before. And we really went for it. And I think we went for it in ways that now I think back on it, were pretty unethical, you know, and, you know, did we really worry back in the 1990s? And I'm just thinking of my first project with prisoners, and I know there are, you know, Laura's here who was there with me. How strongly did we think about protecting or not making vulnerable subjects more vulnerable by the research we were doing? We allowed slipped, you know, this is going to be mea culpa here. You know, we went into a prison in Mordovia interviewing prisoners. You know, were we really sure that it wasn't going to have a negative impact on them after we left? Were they not, you know, how did we know whether they were going to be interrogated by the authorities or not by about the questions we'd asked them? You know, I think it was just such a wonderful opportunity for us to finally be able to get hold of the materials that we wanted to, and to do the interview. You know, doing interviews was not really possible during the Soviet era, not sensible ones. And I think that we are responsible for having, in some senses, pushed ethics to the side, and we failed to I think establish the good practices that we should have done and then handed on to the next generation. And so I think that there are sort of lots of very important ethical issues that have now arisen with the war on Ukraine, which I think have brought all of this to the surface, that we've been terribly sloppy compared with other countries, you know, research that's been done, say, in the global south. I think we were getting away with a lot in the 1990s in Russia, and we've sort of continued with that. But people might disagree with me, but it seems to me that this is a mistake we made. Right. And I think somebody in one of the panels I've been to has made the point of, you know, we went in, we hired Russians to get our data for us, and then we didn't acknowledge them in our articles. You know, those sort of practices, we've become very, very sloppy, I think. And now's the time to really revisit that.
Okay. But I mean, thinking about the I mean, you've addressed them as we've gone along a little bit, but, you know, obviously thinking again about your career trajectory, that you've faced a series of challenges through your career in accessing the materials for the thing you wanted to do. And so the things you wanted to do were actually defined by what you could access. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on, you know, particularly for early career scholars today, and obviously we're in these very active discourses around the shape of the field and our role within it. But what your sort of insights would be for junior scholars in terms of accessing materials and working, you know, particularly in the Russian Federation. You know, how one can go on. What can the scholarship go on, and how?
Gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? And I suspect there are other people here who can answer that better than me. I guess I would. I mean, what I feel, you know, what is sad, and how it's different from, you know, us in the Cold War, because you know, in the Cold War, as I said before, we had very constrained choices of what we could actually do in our research if we wanted to go to the Soviet Union. But equally, if we didn't go to the, you know, for those who didn't go to the Soviet Union, they were having to work with whatever they could, what materials they had. But I have to say that there was some brilliant research done. So that was one thing I would say to the current generation, is that you know, the fact that access to the field might now be denied doesn't actually mean it's the end of your research career. So I think the advice is to pick a topic that is doable in the new constraints, rather than picking a topic that you really, really, really are interested in and you want to do, and then being terribly disappointed when you can't do it because you can't get access to the materials. I think what we always thought is that we would have a core subject that we knew we could do, and we always hoped that, yeah, we could start pushing at the boundaries and take it off in other directions. And so we were flexible to be able to, you know, to follow those directions. And I think we're back in that sort of atmosphere now. But the point is that when, you know, back in the Cold War, we were all, you know, sort of working to sort of forge links, you know, sort of détente was happening, things were getting better, and so we started from zero, and then things got better. Whereas what's sad about if you like the younger generation now, and especially those who started research in the 1980s, you know, had plans for the 1990s, is they've lost something. It's sort of gone backward, but I think it's just you know, choosing topics that are doable. And I think we are back to a situation of having to make that choice. Do we want to go to the region? This is if we're talking about Russia or Belarus, to do research, or whether and what the constraints are going to be. I mean, I think in terms of, you know, the safety of researchers and the safety of the people one's interacting with and collaborating with in Russia, it's a completely different ball game from what it was in the Cold War, when we all knew the rules of the game, and in a sense we were protected by being part of a negotiated exchange agreement. So I think that is what I would say is just always have a fallback plan. I think we always did have fallback plans, and all the research that I've done, you know, because prison research is pretty complicated, even when they want you to do it, and when they don't want you to do it, which is like now, it gets even more complicated. But, you know, putting in the grant application for my ERC grant and also the Academy of Finland grant, I've always write in what the fallback position is. If I'm denied access to the field, you know, I've already got built into the project the different directions it can go into. COVID was the other one, of course, you know, suddenly not being able to go and interview. You have to make sure that you've got something in that project that you can switch to and rebalance to. I say that would be my advice.
That's very good advice. I have other questions, but I think given the constraints of time, I would really like to welcome questions from the floor, because you probably have more exciting ideas than I do. I don't know how we're going to work the floor. Mics, okay. So do we have any questions from the floor? I see a red sweater and a hand in like well back there.
They don't have to be questions, they can be shared experiences.
Sorry.
So there's a person with a red sweater who had their hand up, and then there's a person on the aisle with a black puffy jacket who's also identified an interest in asking something.
My question is, when you are doing interviews with prisoners over there, did you look at the ethnic composition of people who were settling there? Because in majority of cases, this would be people from the peripheries, like Ukraine or, I don't know, Baltic republics and other who were imprisoned by the Soviet regime. And was this part of your inquiry? And the second question is, what is the percent of people with whom you collaborated actually didn't support war in Ukraine?
Okay, no, thank you very much. I'm going to scroll back a bit and go back to the sort of 1990s and the early 2000s, which was when the prison research started. And I talk about the 1990s because Laura Piccentini was the real vanguard in prison studies. She, in the 1990s, went to the Russian Federation and to, I believe it was Irkutsk Oblast, and actually, lived in a correctional colony and interviewed the prisoners who were there. And I don't know, you'll hear somewhere, Lara had a discussion about what your ethical, framework was for doing that, and whether everybody was signing consent forms and so on. I suspect not. But anyway, and it was because of her, when I started collaborating with her, that we then had work, and this is from 2005 onwards, that was part of a collaborative agreement with one of the Russian prison services academies. And they set up the interviews that we undertook in the correctional colonies in Mordovia, which we did in 2007. And we were there for only a short time because we were ejected from Mordovia because Moscow decided that it didn't want us to continue with this research. But we'd already come to the decision at that point that we were not going to continue research and interviews in correctional colonies, because actually we had no choice about whom we were interviewing. We weren't interviewing in confidentially. There was always a prison officer sitting next to us and so on. So when it turned out in the field, the ethical protocols that we thought we'd insisted upon, they just were ignoring them. So we'd already made the decision that we weren't going to interview prisoners anymore. So then, since then, I think all of us have just, where Russia is concerned, only interviewed former prisoners. But we've also undertaken research in interviewing former prisoners. Actually, I hate that term, but anyway, in Kazakhstan, which is where Lara and Gavin have been doing some of their work, in Estonia, in Georgia, and in Uzbekistan and in Romania. But to answer your question about ethnicity, that's what my current project's about, called Gulag Echoes, which is precisely looking at the experiences of different ethnic groups of the various the various prison systems of the countries of the former Soviet bloc and Eastern Europe. And I've just added the Balkans. I'm recently back from, actually was interviewing prison officers in Lepoglava prison in Croatia. So to answer your question, the first project that I was involved with, together with Laura Piccentini, was on women. So we were interested, I think, right from the beginning, by sort of marginal and minority groups in the prison system and how they're treated. And then I've sort of moved on to looking at ethnicity in the prison system. So, you asked the question about since the invasion, we and the people we've used to interview former prisoners in Russia are a group of absolutely excellent social scientists whom have also been employed by Lara and Gavin. And the group, because I'm looking at ethnicity in the prison system, the group necessarily is made up of we've tried to get as many cultural insiders for the different places we've interviewed people in Russia. So, we have some a Tatar woman, Jewish, Russian, and so on. And I don't want to make a statement that can actually be reproduced to say what their views of the war on Ukraine are, because I'm actually, the one thing that's happened since the 24th of February is that I'm very concerned for the protection of the people who have been involved in our research, because it's very controversial research. In Georgia, interviews were done by Georgian and Italian, in Ukraine, in Uzbekistan by an Uzbek, and so in Romania by a Romanian. And Olga and I interviewed Estonian former prisoners. So I don't know if that's sort of answered your question. But I think if your anxiety was, have we just employed, you know, Russians to do all the interviews over the whole area? And the answer to that is no, not of course. Of course we haven't. And the European Research Council, Horizon 2020, sort of ethics review. I mean, my project was held up for 2 or 3 months before I could start, because they wanted me to have cultural insiders for every single interview we did, which would, you know, given that there are 120 different ethnic minorities or sort of and so on in Russia, would have been jolly problematic. So it was one of the things that but I think anybody doing this sort of work, you know, that's part of the territory. That's what you do.
This lady here, and then there's a person in the middle with blonde hair. So
thank you very much, Judith. This is really, really thought-provoking. And I just wanted to follow up on the question of ethics.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any consolation, but certainly what you're saying helps us reflect very carefully about the ethics, what we're doing. But if that's any consolation, I was recently reading some discussion of the field notes from the Harvard project on the Soviet social system, which is a famous project from the 1950s. And some of the field notes said things like, cautious and judicious use of vodka might aid rapport, or only after a little beer party did the respondents finally loosen up. You know, the things like this do make you kind of really think very carefully about how our work will be perceived and the kind of the ethics of research. And so thank you very much also for your other insights.
No, I mean, I think that's, I guess, and, you know, maybe this will be a bit controversial. I think we have to be really very careful about why we are pursuing particular lines of research. Is it because we want to get an article that's going to help us get a job, or is it because we genuinely think and are convinced, and it is true, that we are going to be improving a situation that we are sort of engaged in? In other words, I'm just, you know, I think that what the war on Ukraine has done is make, well, I hope make us, some of us, question the research we are doing, and whether, you know, we don't want to, and this comes in the prison research, you know, one of the questions ethical committees should be asking, we should be asking ourselves, is the work I am doing and I'm going to publish going to stigmatize further an already stigmatized and marginal group? And that is really important. But I've always worked on people at the margins. You know, would I worry if I was interviewing Putin about this? Probably not. But when I was talking about ethical questions, I think that I also have in mind at the present time the way in which I think we've got to ask ourselves, given what Russia is like at the moment, whether, you know, some of the invitations we've accepted in the past, for example, to go to conferences, to have books published for us and so on, I think that we haven't been rigorous enough at looking at where some of that money has come from and why the invitation has been issued to us, because I think that we've been compared with people in other areas of various studies, been rather naive and have failed to notice over the last 20 years that we have sometimes been being used by some of sort of less salubrious Russian institutions. And I think we've got to be very careful of that, we need to be far more rigorous in actually finding out with whom we're cooperating, who it is who's issued this invitation, should we actually accept that invitation, for example, to give a keynote at a conference?
Valeria Karablova, Charles University. First of all, thank you so much for sharing the atmosphere of those whole days. And if you don't mind, I want to connect my question to the topic of this debate. We talk a lot about, or at least someone says that we need to decolonize area studies. But recently in Hanover, I heard an interesting idea of my German colleagues that we need to think about decold Warization of our thinking. So
Sorry,
I wonder that given your experience, do you see any residues of the Cold War mentality in area studies? And if so, what it could be? Because I believe that this weirdly sounding notion of decold Warization could be interpreted very differently, right? So some people would think that we should not reconstruct Russia as the enemy, but others might think that it's about something different. For instance, it's about like attention to minor actors, not like putting Russia in the center of attention at all. Or for instance, like what you mentioned, that there was this intellectual disbelief that what media or newspapers write about Russia is maybe not true. So if you can comment on this sort of residual Cold War mentality in area studies, if it's present from your perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, so the residual Cold War mentality is people are the people who are critical of Russia. Is that right at the current time? Right. Because I think, I mean, the more problematic thing I think is far more, and I'm sorry that's not really answering your question, because I'm sort of trying to fully to understand it. I mean, I think the idea that, you know, we're in the Second Cold War is problematic, but actually the people I find, or rather the ideas that I find most problematic at the moment are much more those of the liberal left in Western scholarship. There are sort of colleagues, and that is talking about somebody who precisely, you know, sort of comes from the left. But I'm really quite surprised by some colleagues who, you know, it's the old thing about it's NATO's fault for why, you know, Russia has invaded Ukraine. It's those scholars that I don't know if they fit into this idea of Cold War scholarship. I'm finding that sort of very, very difficult. But I think there are probably other people here, and I'd like to hear about the de-Cold Warization of Russian and East European studies.
There's a person with a blue sweater about 2 lines behind you.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond on this. Shall I? Okay. On this matter of the Cold War framework, I think there's a wonderful literature about concepts that kind of repeat the Cold War narrative in the post-Cold War era, and especially, and even after 30 years of the transformation. And one of the wonderful examples of that is the debate about democratic backsliding and the terms of authoritarianism, for instance, that assumes that all these post-socialist countries are naturally inclined to the Soviet past, to repeating the kind of attributes related with their Soviet past. Whereas this critique, which has been produced based on decades-long empirical research, basically says that all these new waves of authoritarianism is actually part of a reactionary aspect of the global integration of these states into this kind of global capitalist system. So this is one of the so this literature basically points to the necessity of somehow problematizing these issues not as part of the socialist past as this normative story of transition, a normative and teleological story of transition tells us, but instead kind of finding the new and uncovering the new contradictions and new political conflicts that were created in the post-socialist world. So that was a kind of a short comment on what you just.
Yes, no, well, thank you for that clarification. I think one of the things that I would sort of think that we've got to really keep in our minds when we're having these sorts of debates is that actually this isn't a Cold War, it's a hot war, and we've not been here before. And actually what is happening is that, you know, people in part of the region are being killed, buildings are being demolished, and you know, a whole people is being told what their identity is. And this is a completely new topic for us. And I'm sure that, you know, discussions about you know, the framing and whether it's a Cold War framing or not, and you know what you've been talking is absolutely important, and it's one of the things that you know, the academy should be doing, and we should be doing in area studies. But you know, we mustn't actually, the immediate problem is that's happening in the area is that Cold War has actually turned, well, I'm not going to say the Cold War has turned hot, because that would be saying, oh yes, it's a war between Russia and NATO, which and which I don't believe. It's, you know, it's a war between Russia and Ukraine, and I'm finding it very difficult to at the moment to think sort of beyond that. But it's very important that, of course, that we do. But I personally, you know, having been in this field for, oh, blimey, it's, you know, 50 years, I'm finding it very difficult to, you know, think beyond what is happening at the moment, you know, in Ukraine. But if I was at the beginning of my career, I would certainly be thinking in those sorts of terms and trying to understand, you know, the historical trajectory of everything that's going on.
So I have a person at the back, I think it's Erin Reddish as well, who's there. And then I have another person somewhere in the mid-range there.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm wondering, kind of based on what you just said, like, you know, what do we tell students, and kind of, we're having this existential crisis, what do we tell students what to study over the next 5 or 10 years? Do you have ideas about kind of intellectual pursuits? What do we do if there aren't archives? You know, I'm coming at this as a historian, so.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are lots of people in this hall who can answer that question, Erin. But I mean, the point is that there are two fetishes, I think, that have afflicted Russian and East European studies, you know, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and at the present time. And one is archives and the other is interviews. So I think that my suggestion would be is try to think of some research topics that don't require you to use the Russian archives, because you're not going to get in them, you know. So forget about that, and you know, stop thinking about research that, you know, this is what I think the social scientists. Now, you know, I'm guilty, because all my research at the moment is, well, not all of it, but some of it is based on interviews. There's this real fetishization, I can't say it, fetishization of the interview. And it was partly because, you know, in the 1990s, suddenly we could go and talk to people. You know, I could talk to peasants. Actually, they weren't really peasants, actually. They're, you know, subaltern personages and so on. So I think I would suggest trying to think of topics. It goes back to what I was saying before, that are actually doable. And it would be great if you get into the archives as well. You know, that there's a lot of history that can be done without archives. There were some brilliant histories written in the 1950s, 60s and 70s without archival sources, or, you know, the Smolensk archive, we all ran to the Smolensk archive and so on. That at the present time, there's a lot of the archives that have been digitized, you know, the great volumes of them. I don't know if people are actually using them in their research rather than going into the archives themselves. So I think historians can do history without archives, can they? Here's Misha here, he'll probably say no, they can't, but you know, so what are the topics? I mean, there's a wealth of topics to to study, and that's, you know, but that's we're only just now beginning that debate of the direction. But I think what we've got to get out of our minds is that we can choose topics that we know our colleagues are doing in the UK, or our colleagues are doing somewhere in Europe, or even indeed in the global South. You know, we've not got to then, you know, try to do that and bound to be disappointed by being unable to do it. But, you know, there's all that other part of, I don't say the former Soviet Union, I'll get, I know that's the wrong thing to say now, but of the area in which we are interested. There are lots and lots of countries with enormously interesting topics, and not the same sort of restrictions as there are going to be in Russia. But I don't want research on Russia to stop. That's very important. But as I said, I think that's what for you, the young, you know, the next generation is to debate and to discuss. Do you have a view on that?
No, I haven't. And I was very clear that you were not going to interview me, and I'm not going to be drawn into that narrative. But there are a number of audience members who would like to ask you a question, Judy. So there's a person there with their hand raised, with a green, there's, yeah, that person there.
Oh, and
then there's a hand with a paper, which is...
no, that's, we're going to hear from him. He's going to contradict everything I said.
Oh, so you want me to shout him down? I'll bear that in mind. And there's a gentleman behind the person in the green sweater about to speak as well. Yeah.
Is he a young gentleman?
Not particularly.
Right.
No disrespect.
You know, it's particular identity. You know, you have various
gentleman.
criteria you have to fulfill. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Dr. Yulia Bedenko from Karasin Kharkiv University and also a research fellow for TSOES. And you raised a lot of hard questions, especially about ethics in our work. And I'm thinking not about I'm thinking about ethics, not about only in a sense how to protect people who we probably can put into the risk when we are publishing the interview or even making this interview in some circumstances. But I'm also thinking about ethics as our responsibility as scholars, in the front of society, in the front of our broader circles of colleagues, in the front of policy makers. And actually, what I was thinking about during the lecture, that the path from the Cold War to a hot war actually was making not in a one step. And there were some signals in the region, starting probably since 2005, but I would point it like 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia, then 2014 when Russia occupied Crimea, launched its troops in Donbass. Should we be responsible of kind of sleepwalking to this point? And should we, which I would say takeaways we could make from this point of view, or should we be only neutral and thinking about whether this topic doable for our students or not at this certain moment of time? Thank you.
Yes, I think, I mean, do you want to take other, I mean, thank you very much. I don't, I'm not sure that I know how to answer that question. I'm sorry, but you know, earlier in what you said, you were sort of implying that in some sense we had missed the signs, and I think I would contest that. Because it was the same thing was said when the Soviet Union collapsed, you know, somehow we'd failed to see it. That's not true at all. It had been on the table, you know, for the collapse of the Soviet Union as one of the possibilities. And actually, where the war on Ukraine's concerned, it was there on the table of, you know, as one of the possibilities. Now, we thought, like the majority of people in the world, and I think also the majority of people in Russia, that wasn't what was going to be chosen, you know, that particular path, and we were surprised by it. But we certainly had been discussing it, and we had noticed all the, you know, some people in the area had noticed all the signs of what was coming. And I think we'd actually sort of done that really carefully, so it was noticed. So I mean, if your question was, should we now be looking at why it happened, or should we be sort of doing research that's projecting forward? I think my answer to that would be both. But I don't think that was what you were asking.
Judy, we do have more questions, but it is 7 o'clock, and I believe that it is time. I'm getting indicators if it's time to have a drink or a refreshing beverage. Thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. Thank you, chairs. You're done.